I've always believed that the soul of a family lives in the kitchen. That's where the stories rise just like dough, slowly, warmly over time. Every Christmas, for as long as I've had the strength in my hands and a roof over my head, I've set that table myself, not just with plates and forks, but with care. Every napkin tucked just right, every candle lit with intention, every dish holding a piece of my history. The ham glazed with brown sugar, the way my husband liked it. The apple stuffing from my mother's old recipe folded into my fingers from the time I was barely tall enough to see the stovetop. That table was my altar, my offering, a place where everyone who sat down knew, without needing to say it, that they belonged. This past Christmas started no different on the surface. I woke up early, pulling on the same worn sweater I've worn for a dozen Decembers, a threadbare thing that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine. I moved through my kitchen slowly but with purpose, measuring flour, without looking, humming softly to the sound of the kettle hissing. The house felt heavy with memory. Quiet, yes, but not empty. At least not yet. They began arriving in the afternoon. The laughter at the door was the kind that used to warm me, until I noticed that none of it rose to my ears. I opened the door to see smiles, but they felt stretched too tightly like masks you forget you're wearing. My granddaughter leaned in with a brisk kiss on my cheek, her purse slung over one shoulder like she had better places to be. "We'll help you with setup," she said, already brushing past me into the living room without waiting for an answer. Help, I thought. That word again. Lately it seemed to come wrapped in condescension, as if I were a fragile vase someone had to keep from toppling over. The others followed her lead. Jackets were dropped, shoes kicked aside. I watched them move around the house like it was theirs now, rearranging chairs, adjusting lighting, critiquing the flow of the table I had spent all morning perfecting. I said nothing. Not yet. I still held on to the illusion that once the food came out, once everyone was gathered around with plates full and mouths busy, that maybe the warmth would return. Maybe they'd see me again, not just as the woman who baked the pie, but as the one who raised them. Dinner started well enough. They complimented the turkey passed around dishes, toasted with sparkling cider that my granddaughter had insisted on over my usual mulled wine. I smiled politely, letting that one go. One drink didn't matter. But it was during the second round of serving when I reached for the cider jug, just instinct really, that her hand intercepted mine mid-air. "Oh no, Grandma, you're trembling. Let me do it." Her tone was sweet, soft, coated with the exact kind of faux kindness that lands like a slap. I looked down. My hand was steady, a little slower than it once was sure, but not trembling. Still I pulled it back, cheeks warming in front of everyone. I laughed it off, a brittle sound that didn't match the pit blooming in my stomach. I said nothing again, but the seed was planted. I watched the way she took over, gliding around the table like a host correcting others when they reached for things too early, telling my grandson not to slouch, reminding her own mother, my daughter, not to speak with her mouth full. It was as though she had appointed herself guardian of tradition, yet stripped all the tenderness out of it. Her voice carried her hands, always moving her presence, taking up more space than mine in my own home. Later, when I excused myself to the kitchen to fetch the plum pudding, I stood at the sink for a moment and listened. Their voices behind me, laughter laced with something else, mockery, or maybe just detachment. I couldn't tell anymore. I gripped the edge of the counter and stared at my reflection in the dark window. My sweater looked too old, my earrings too modest. I'd been hosting Christmas for over 40 years, and suddenly it felt like I had been demoted, like I was only invited to play the part of the old woman who warms the house and then fades into the wallpaper. I carried the pudding out anyway, smiling for the camera they set up on a tripod. My granddaughter made sure the lighting was right, that the photos captured the aesthetic. I realized then that this wasn't Christmas to her. It was content. A curated performance where joy was pre-approved and posted. A show where I was just an extra with good lighting and sentimental value. When the meal ended and the dishwasher began its weary cycle, they drifted into the living room. I stayed behind, cleared the table slowly, feeling the ache in my knees, but also in my chest. I used to clear it with help laughter echoing as hands worked together, teasing over who'd burned the rolls or overstuffed the yams. But now the only voice in the kitchen was mine, humming quietly to no one. I was alone with my thoughts, and they weren't kind. Something in me began to shift that night. Not a scream or a slam or a sob, just a slow, still realization that I had been hosting people who no longer saw me. They saw my table, my food, my house, but not me. Not the woman who built it all with sacrifice and threadbare hope. That was the night the seed was planted. It would take time to bloom. But the roots began to spread quietly beneath the surface. The days that followed that Christmas were colder than usual, though the thermostat never dipped. I could feel the chill in other places in the way my phone stayed quiet, in the silence after they left. There were no thank you calls, no sweet messages, not even a leftover container returned. Just a hollow house, and that odd emptiness that clings when something has shifted, but you're not yet ready to name it. I kept replaying moments in my head, not because I was looking for drama, but because something inside me wanted to understand when I stopped being family and started being a responsibility they managed. I remember the look my granddaughter gave me when I reached for the gravy boat. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even frustration. It was closer to embarrassment, like she was quietly apologizing to the others for me. I've seen that look before on strangers helping someone cross the street too slowly, or in the supermarket when a child corrects an elderly parent out loud. It's a look that says, "I love you, but you're in the way." And it slices sharper than a raised voice ever could. Everyone was smiling that night. Oh yes, there were smiles aplenty, but they didn't reach the eyes. They were the kind of smiles you wear when you're being polite to someone you don't really want to be near. Not cruel, just distant. As if I were a guest at my own celebration. As if I'd wandered into someone else's holiday, and they were too nice to tell me to leave. My granddaughter had always been the assertive one. Even as a child, she liked things her way, and I used to smile at that call at confidence, a trait I hoped would serve her well in life. But there's a fine line between leadership and dominance, and I saw now that somewhere along the line she'd stopped asking and started directing. What began as childhood boldness had hardened into adult control, and Christmas was just her stage. She had these glances she shared with the others, little flicks of the eye, when someone said something she didn't approve of. When I made a joke that didn't land the way I hoped, her eyes darted to her fiancé, and they both smiled in that quiet, knowing way. That's what hurt most. Not what she said, but what she didn't. The unspoken critiques, the way she polished everything to perfection, and brushed aside anything that didn't match her vision, including me. Even the music was curated. I had set my old records on the shelf beside the stereo, Bing Crosby, Nat King Cole, but she had already synced a playlist through the speaker's soft instrumental jazz that made the room feel more like a high-end restaurant than a home. I said nothing. Again. My voice felt too small to use that night. And when I offered to say grace before the meal, as I had done every single Christmas since her mother was a child, she gently placed her hand over mine and said, "Actually, Grandpa recorded one years ago. I thought we could play that." I froze. Of course I loved hearing his voice, but not as a replacement. Not when I was right there with my hands folded, my heart open, and decades of love aching to be heard. They played his recording while I sat silently, mouth closed, tears threatening but not welcome. Even my grief had been prearranged, packaged neatly, so no one had to feel uncomfortable. Every moment felt choreographed, and I hadn't been given the script. At one point, someone asked my granddaughter where she got the centerpiece. It was a towering display of ivory roses and pale gold ribbon. Beautiful, yes, but sterile. She laughed and said, "Oh, Grandma was going to use those little red ones again, but I found this modern one online. Don't you think it's more sophisticated?" They all nodded, complimenting her taste. I smiled thinly. I had grown those red ones myself, cut them with shears while the frost still clung to their stems, but now they sat discarded in the garage, left out of the vision. That night became a catalogue of small moments, each one quiet enough to dismiss, yet collectively loud enough to drown out the joy I'd worked so hard to create. I watched them pose for selfies beside the tree, adjusting their angles, lighting filters. My granddaughter even nudged me out of one frame. "Let's do one of just the cousins," she said, already cropping me out before the flash had cooled. I stood there for a moment, hands folded, staring at the blinking lights, the ornaments I had collected over decades, some handmade, some gifted, some bought during lean years when we couldn't afford more. And there they were, treated like props. No one asked about them. No one touched the wooden reindeer my late husband carved with his shaky hands in the winter of '92. No one commented on the tiny felt stocking with my name sewn in half, unraveling at the seams. I was surrounded by people I loved and had given everything to, and yet I felt like the ghost of someone they were politely tolerating. After dessert, I sat alone in my chair while they gathered near the fireplace. They laughed at stories I didn't recognize, made plans I wasn't part of. My granddaughter talked about her upcoming trip, how she'd use her bonus to renovate their new kitchen. She glanced at me when she said it, casually mentioning how this old place could use a refresh. I said nothing, but inside something pulsed. Polite smiles, sharp glances, the kind that cut clean, so clean you don't notice you're bleeding until you stand up and feel dizzy. That was the beginning of the unraveling, not because they yelled, not because they stormed out, but because they didn't have to. Their absence was louder than any argument. Their performance left no room for truth, and I was no longer willing to clap from the shadows. Something was changing in me, slowly, deliberately. I didn't know yet what it meant, only that I wouldn't forget how this Christmas felt. It was in the way she reached over my shoulder to straighten the silverware, as if my eyes had betrayed me. It was in the way she adjusted the thermostat, without asking, mumbling that older skin is thinner and I might not notice how stuffy it had become. It was in the tone she used when she said, "Let me take that from you," as I held the cranberry sauce in both hands, like I'd done for 40 years, firmly, confidently, without a single accident. She spoke gently, always gently. That was the trick. Nothing she said could be pointed to as cruelty, but I recognized the tone. It was the same one I used to hear from the nurses when I had my hip replaced. The one that says, "We're being nice to you because we've already decided you can't handle anything yourself," the way a teacher might speak to a forgetful child. Only I wasn't a child. I was the woman who had hosted Christmas without fail, through grief, illness, and pinched paychecks. I was the one who stayed up nights sewing costumes for school plays, who sold baked goods to cover piano lessons, who nursed her mother through the end. I wasn't forgetful. I remembered too much. That was the real problem. I remembered how it used to be when I was the center of this family, not the inconvenience in the corner. The first time I tried to speak up was over the gravy. I mentioned that she hadn't stirred it enough it would separate if left too long on the stove. "Grandma," she said not unkindly, "we looked it up. It's meant to settle. That's how modern chefs do it now." I blinked, confused. Settle? It had never settled before, not the way I made it. But she was already whisking it away, her fiancé trailing after her, nodding. Later, I went to light the tall candles in the middle of the table, the ones I bought years ago at that church market, back when I could barely afford extras. They were creamy white with tiny flecks of gold, simple, but beautiful. I'd saved them for a special occasion, but as I struck the match, she rushed over and blew it out. "Oh no, Grandma, not those. They're not dripless. I brought flameless ones. It's safer." She held up small plastic candles with switches at the base. "See? Just as pretty." I looked at them, cold, sterile, devoid of scent, of flicker of magic. I nodded again. What else was there to do? I slid my real candles back into the drawer, tucked them away like something shameful. And when I did, I realized I was doing the same thing to myself. Even the tree hadn't escaped her vision. I'd decorated it the day before with ornaments wrapped in years of meaning. The angel on top had belonged to my sister. The crocheted snowflakes were made by a neighbor long gone. But she'd moved several of them around for balance, she said. She brought new ones, gold spheres, spotless and impersonal, and placed them front and center. She called it elevating the aesthetic. I called it erasing the past. I kept catching myself second-guessing every little thing I did that night. When I poured cider, I checked the cup twice. When I passed a dish, I looked around first to be sure no one else wanted to do it for me. I'd become hesitant in my own kitchen, like a guest afraid to misstep, like a child on edge not wanting to do the wrong thing and ruin the grown-up's mood. And that's how I realized what had happened. Somewhere along the way, I had been quietly demoted, not by decree, not by intention, but by slow, invisible erosion. It was the way they complimented her organizing skills without acknowledging my decades of effort. It was the way she spoke over me when someone asked how the turkey was made. The way she snapped, "No, Grandma," not like that when I tried to carve a slice of pie. I bit my tongue until the pie turned to ash in my mouth. She didn't see it, I don't think. Or maybe she did. Maybe she thought she was doing me a favor, keeping me from tiring myself out or embarrassing myself. It's a dangerous kind of cruelty, that. The kind wrapped in soft tones and sweet smiles. The kind that calls itself love, but never listens. My daughter said little that night. She sat with that tight-lipped expression I know all too well, the one that says, "Let's not make this a thing." But it was a thing. It had been becoming a thing for years, and this time the weight of it settled so heavily on my chest, I thought I might cry right there in front of the tree and the filtered jazz and the too white centerpiece. But I didn't. I waited. I cleared dishes. I wiped counters. I watched them gather for photos and watched my granddaughter reposition my own daughter to better frame the shot. And I thought about all the ways I'd been gently corrected, softly pushed aside, smoothed over until I barely existed. When they left that night, she hugged me tightly. "Next year, we'll host at our place, okay? You can just relax and enjoy." It was supposed to be a kindness, a reward, but it felt like a dismissal, like being told I'd had a good run, but my time was up. As I stood alone in the doorway, waving to the blur of headlights pulling away, I finally let the tears come, quietly, slowly, like wax dripping down an unused candle. I wasn't angry yet. That came later. I was just hollow. A house with the lights off, the music stopped, and the echoes of laughter that had nothing to do with me. That's the thing about being corrected like a child. After a while, you stop speaking up altogether. And when your silence is mistaken for agreement, they think they're helping. But what they're really doing is teaching you how to disappear. I began to notice the way they position themselves, not just physically, but emotionally. The way my granddaughter stood at the head of the table while explaining the seating arrangement, smiling, of course, always smiling, as she gently redirected me from my usual chair at the end. "Let's let you sit by the window this year," she said, already placing my napkin elsewhere like it had never belonged in that spot. I said nothing. The window seat was lovely, sure, but it was not mine. Not the one I had always taken, the one where I could oversee everything and everyone, where I used to pour cider and say grace and beam at the laughter around me. This time, I watched the room from an angle like an outsider in a place I built. It wasn't an accident. These moments never are. Families don't collapse in storms. They erode inch by inch, smile by smile, until you don't recognize the shoreline. My granddaughter arranged the chairs not by age or tradition, but by convenience and optics. Younger ones closer to the tree for better photos, her fiancé beside her for better hosting flow. My seat just near enough to keep me visible, but far enough to keep me out of the conversation. I saw the patterns, how she redirected questions meant for me. How she spoke for her mother, spoke for her cousins, and even gently for me, finishing my thoughts when I hesitated for half a second, claiming it was just helping move things along. It's a strange thing being interpreted in real time like you're a foreign language. No one has the patience to understand anymore. The food was another quiet battlefield. She presented a few side dishes she'd prepared herself, roasted Brussels sprouts, whipped goat cheese with cranberries. All lovely. But when one of the cousins said, "Oh, this is the best dish here," she smiled sweetly and said, "Thank you," not even mentioning the roast I'd basted since dawn, the stuffing I'd seasoned from instinct, not from Google. No one touched the sweet potatoes. Too rustic, maybe. Not modern enough. They took pictures of the goat cheese. She whispered instructions behind cupped hands, fixing someone's posture, adjusting a cousin's hair, before the group photo, telling her fiancé not to talk over her when she welcomed everyone. And there I was watching it all, this quiet choreography that had very little to do with celebration and everything to do with control. The hierarchy wasn't spoken aloud, but it didn't need to be. She was the hostess now. She was the vision. I was the relic. Even my words were handled like fragile things. At one point, I shared a little story from years past, how her mother, my daughter, had once broken the cookie jar, trying to sneak a sugar cookie before dinner. It was a funny memory, gentle and sweet. But my granddaughter laughed awkwardly and said, "Let's not bring up embarrassing stories, Grandma. Not during dinner." Her voice wasn't harsh, but it had the finality of a closed door. What I learned that night was this: there are 1,000 ways to silence someone without ever telling them to be quiet. You change the topic. You redirect the spotlight. You offer them a smaller role. You place them by the window. You smile. Always smile. And they'll sit there smiling too, unsure of when they stopped being part of the story and started being its background. It's not that I need attention. I've lived enough years to know how fleeting that is. I didn't need applause for my cooking or a speech in my honor. I just wanted to feel included, to feel like my presence mattered, not out of obligation, but out of love. But what I felt more than anything was that I had become ornamental, like the wreath on the door, seasonal, traditional, and quietly ignored once inside. There was a moment late in the evening when the fire had settled into a low glow, and everyone was gathered around opening small gifts. I had knitted scarves for each of them weeks in advance. My hands had ached, but I wanted to give something handmade, something warm, something that said, "You still have me." They opened them politely, smiled, thanked me, then set them aside. Moments later, my granddaughter handed out small gift bags, slick branded uniform. Inside were luxury soaps, gift cards, sleek gadgets. The room buzzed with excitement. So thoughtful, they said. So stylish, I sat there with the yarn still under my fingernails, watching them praise her for her taste, her generosity, her flair. No one looked at the scarves again. That night, after everyone left, I sat in the darkened dining room. I didn't bother to turn on the lamp. The tree's lights flickered behind me, casting long shadows across the dishes. I would wash alone. I thought about all the years I'd done this, planned, cooked, hosted, hugged. All the times I held the family together with threadbare hands and whispered reassurances. I was the glue once. Now I was the tape on the box they'd outgrown. And yet I hadn't spoken a word of protest. Not one. Because when the hierarchy is unspoken, confronting it feels like you're the one causing trouble. Like you're the one making things uncomfortable. That's how they keep the order intact, by making you question your right to challenge it. By convincing you that silence is grace, and that speaking up is a burden. But as I sat there in the dark, I realized something quietly dangerous. Grace without boundaries becomes surrender. And I was done surrendering. I don't know the exact year it all began to shift. Maybe it happened in pieces so small I barely noticed them falling. Or maybe it happened all at once and I simply wasn't ready to admit it. But that Christmas, sitting alone in the dining room after they'd gone, my lap covered in crumbs, the smell of lemon soap still clinging to the air, I missed my family in a way that hurt deep in the bone. Not the people they had become, but the family we used to be. I missed the laughter that didn't wait for someone to approve it. I missed the mismatched chairs pulled from the garage to make room for everyone, even if it meant someone got stuck sitting on a wobbly stool. I missed the spilled cider, the crooked ornaments, the children running through the hallways with sticky hands and wide eyes. I missed my husband winking at me across the table, as if to say, "Look what we built." It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Back then, Christmas was noisy and messy and full. Nobody worried about matching napkins or candle arrangements. We told the same stories every year and still laughed at them. My son once brought a girlfriend who wore ripped jeans and called me ma'am like I was a school principal. She forgot to bring a dish, so we made her stir the gravy while we teased her into the family. I gave her a second helping. She didn't last, but the memory did. I missed my daughter's laugh before life made it quieter. I missed when she'd lean into me for advice, not glance sideways to her own child for validation. I missed being useful, not out of pride, but out of love. Love, after all, is a verb, a doing thing. And I had loved them in all the ways I knew how, through casseroles and advice, through mended clothes and late-night talks, through bailouts and blessings and backpats when their lives crumbled. I loved them even when they made me small. But that night, with the fireplace flickering low and my house too quiet, I realized how long it had been since anyone looked at me like I held the thread that stitched us together. Now they looked at me like I was the old quilt on the back of the couch, sentimental, warm, but mostly decorative. I wasn't needed. I was endured. I remember one year, not long after my husband passed, when my granddaughter was just a teenager. She came into the kitchen while I was basting the turkey and sat on the counter legs swinging like she had no worries. "You always make it feel like Christmas," she said. No one had prompted her. She just felt it in the warmth of the kitchen, the hum of old music, the smell of cinnamon and butter. That was before she had her Instagram account, before she knew the word aesthetic. She used to watch me, not with scrutiny but with wonder. I used to be her compass, her calm, her keeper of magic. Now she was too busy curating moments to remember who gave her the recipe for joy. I stood up slowly, knees aching, and walked through the house room by room. I looked at the gifts left behind, some still unopened, others already discarded on side tables. I picked up the knitted scarf I made for her fiancé, still folded, still untouched. I held it in my hands for a long while before placing it gently on the coat rack. Let them forget it. Let them wonder where it went. The photos from the evening had already gone up by the time I checked my phone. There we were, smiling, cheerful, gathered. The caption read, "Christmas vibes with the best people." I scanned the pictures. In some I wasn't even visible. In others I was blurred or cropped. And in one I was standing alone, behind the kitchen counter mid-laugh, while everyone else posed by the tree. It looked like I was serving them, not part of them. I put the phone down. I didn't comment. I didn't like the post. I just let it sit there like a sealed box I didn't need to open. Later that night I pulled out the old photo albums, not the digital kind, but the heavy leather-bound one with sticky pages and curling corners. I turned the pages slowly, breathing in the scent of dust and time. There we all were, messy, bright-eyed young. My daughter with braces and pink cheeks. My son holding a toy fire truck. My granddaughter in footed pajamas, face smeared with pie. And me, right in the center, always in the center. I pressed my palm to one photo and closed my eyes. I don't know when they stopped seeing me as the woman who built this house with love and started seeing me as someone they had to handle. But that night, I knew I missed something I'd never get back. Not the holiday, not the food, but the feeling. That old shimmering feeling that you belong fully, wholly, without needing to earn your place. I missed being part of a family that loved loudly and imperfectly. The kind of family that didn't correct you at the table or reorganize your traditions like clutter. I missed being seen. And the ache of that missing didn't fade when I turned off the tree lights. It settled in my bones like winter. But here's what else I realized. As I sat there beneath the weight of it all, memories can warm you, but they can also wake you. And what stirred in me that night wasn't just grief. It was the beginning of clarity. The word helping used to be a comfort, back when I truly needed it, when I broke my wrist that winter, or when I lost my footing in the garden and couldn't quite lift myself without leaning on the porch rail. Help was hands on my elbow, a warm blanket tucked over my knees, a child's voice offering to carry the groceries. Help was a gift, a tenderness, a moment of shared care. But this, what she did now, this wasn't help. It was performance wrapped in politeness. It was control cloaked in concern. That Christmas night, I replayed every instant she'd used the word helping and realized what it really meant in her mouth, taking over, replacing, editing me out. "Let me help you with the playlist, Grandma," she had said just before deleting the old carols I'd queued up, replacing them with instrumental background music that didn't even carry a voice, just soft echoing notes that meant nothing to no one. "Let me help you arrange the table," she'd offered just before removing the hand-painted reindeer place cards I made 5 years ago with my great-grandchildren, replacing them with store-bought golden calligraphy tags tied in twine. She even changed the scent of the room. I'd lit a cinnamon candle, something warm, familiar, earthy. Minutes later, she opened a window and set a reed diffuser near the entrance. "The spice is a little strong, don't you think? I brought eucalyptus and sage. More clean, more modern." She smiled like she'd done me a favor. I'd spent my whole life believing love meant making room, but her version of love was about making space by removing things. And slowly, so slowly, I didn't even notice at first I had become one of the things removed. She meant well, I know that, or at least I think she did. But good intentions can still leave bruises. And it wasn't the big gestures that broke me down, it was the hundreds of tiny ones. The way she reached for the knife before I could slice the pie. The way she adjusted the ornaments after I'd hung them. The way she lowered the music when I tried to sing along. I even remember how she helped me dress. I had picked out a forest green blouse, one I'd worn for years. Modest, soft, comfortable. But when she saw it, her face twitched just slightly. "It's sweet," she said, "but I brought you this." She pulled out a pale pink sweater still in its box. "Just something light and soft for photos. You'll look amazing in it." I held it in my hands like it might dissolve. I didn't want to wear it. It wasn't me. But I didn't want to embarrass her either. So I changed and smiled and sat in the corner of the family photo like a dressed-up stranger in her own house. Even my stories weren't safe. When one of the younger cousins asked how Grandpa used to carve the turkey, I started to answer, started to tell how he'd hum a song from the radio while sharpening the knife, how he always gave me the first slice of dark meat. But she interrupted with, "Oh, I don't think they really care about all that, Grandma. We just cut it straight through, now it's cleaner." Cleaner, more efficient, less memory. I stopped trying after that. Let her lead. Let her shine. Let her help. The only problem was I vanished in the process. And still I tried to justify it. Maybe this was her way of expressing love. Maybe she just wanted things to go well. Maybe I was being oversensitive. That's the trap of quiet erasure. It makes you question your own worth instead of the world's behavior. But that night, when I was finally alone, with the dishes and the scent of sage in the air instead of cinnamon, something in me snapped. Not loud, not violent, just a gentle, decisive tear. Like the moment when an old thread finally gives out. You don't blame the thread. You just stop trying to stitch with it. Because I finally saw what her helping really meant. She didn't want my participation. She wanted my presence, quiet, posed, managed. The family matriarch who sat in the corner and didn't make trouble. The sentimental figurehead who smiled for the holiday card and stayed silent in the planning. She wanted the house, the name, the legacy, but not the voice behind it. She called it helping. I called it being replaced. Later that night, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside was a folder, blue, slightly worn, marked in my handwriting, estate and legacy documents. I pulled it out slowly, like lifting something sacred. Inside were years of decisions, beneficiaries, instructions, letters, my original will written when I believed my family would honor more than my money. They'd honor my memory. I sat at the kitchen table under the dull light, reading through every page. The language was clear. Everything divided equally. My house, my savings, my precious little heirlooms, all spoken for, all passed down with the same hands that were now being gently pushed away from the gravy bowl. I looked at the section listing my granddaughter's name, and I thought of how she'd corrected my every move that day, how she'd adjusted the lighting, altered the menu, softened the music, replaced the stories, and even picked out my clothes. And I realized she didn't see me anymore. She saw a role, and I was done playing it. You can tell a lot about a home by its decorations, not just what's displayed, but what's missing. That Christmas, my house looked beautiful, magazine beautiful, as if someone had walked through with a checklist for a lifestyle shoot, garlands draped just so, ornaments in a tight gold and white color scheme, place cards scripted in glossy ink, and tiny white lights woven with machine-like precision. Everything was polished, everything gleamed, but none of it felt like it was mine. I walked from room to room that evening, my feet soft on the carpet, and took it all in the transformation of a home I had built with my own hands, now redesigned into something quiet and cold. Aesthetic. That's the word she kept using. This will elevate the aesthetic, Grandma, as if the soul of Christmas could be improved with the right accent pillow. She replaced my knitted stockings with matching burlap ones. Neutral tones, no names stitched in red, just anonymous holders for curated gifts. She tucked away the ceramic reindeer I'd painted with the children years ago and placed instead a sleek glass tree filled with silver beads. It's more minimalist, she said. Minimalist. A word I'd only heard in design blogs, now somehow in my living room. Even the tree had been redone. I had decorated it the morning before with the same ornaments I used every year. Faded gingerbread men from the 80s, my husband's tin soldier, from his boyhood a tiny bell from our first apartment when we couldn't afford a full tree. I'd tucked little candy canes between branches, tied red ribbon by hand, and stood back that morning with a soft smile, pleased with the old cluttered beauty of it. But by the time everyone arrived, the tree had changed. The candy canes were gone. The red ribbons had been removed and replaced with sheer white bows. She'd added glass bulbs and golden tinsel. My handmade ornaments had been moved to the back where no one would see them. When I noticed, I said nothing. I just stood there for a moment, pretending to adjust a pine cone on a nearby garland. But inside I felt something slip, like being edited out of your own life. She meant well, I keep telling myself that. She always does. But meaning well doesn't undo the quiet violence of being erased. I saw it in the way the table centerpiece towered over the dishes, beautiful but impractical. It blocked everyone's view of each other, so they leaned around it, making strained eye contact across the pillar of designer florals. I'd bought poinsettias, traditional and bright, just like I always did. She left them in the garage, said they clashed with the soft elegance she was going for. Even the smell was different. Christmas to me smells like orange peels on the stove cloves, pressed into ham cinnamon thick in the air. But this year the room smelled of lavender and sage, soft and spa-like with hints of eucalyptus. It was clean, yes, but it didn't smell like home. It smelled like a store. And perhaps that's what she wanted, something that could be photographed, admired, shared online with captions like, "Our cozy family holiday." But nothing about it felt cozy to me. It felt staged, like I'd stepped into a showroom of what Christmas was supposed to be, for strangers. They posed for pictures in front of the tree, holding their drinks just right, angling their faces toward the fireplace. My granddaughter directed the shots like a film set. Move to the left, chin down a bit, smile but not too much. She didn't ask me to be in many of them. And when she did, it was always on the side next to the dog, or the mantle, like I was part of the background texture. Nostalgic, yes, but not essential. I sat down eventually in my chair, the one by the window, the one she'd reassigned me to, and I just watched. The laughter didn't ring the way it used to. It echoed, bounced off the new decorations, but never reached the corners of the room where love used to live. It was all just image. And the saddest part, they didn't even notice I had grown quiet. They didn't ask about the ornaments, didn't ask where the candy canes went. No one commented on the absence of Grandpa's old wooden sled that always stood in the corner. It used to be the centerpiece of our holiday storytelling, his tales of snowstorms and childhood, and a hill so steep he broke his collarbone at age 12. The sled was gone now, boxed away. Not on theme, she had said. And with it the stories disappeared too. I tried once to bring it back. After dinner, while they played a board game and sipped cocktails, I mentioned the time my husband had burned the yams, but served them anyway, claiming it was a smoky southern twist. I chuckled softly. Silence. No one looked up. My granddaughter said, "We don't really do sweet potatoes anymore. Too heavy." Then returned to her phone. Decorations without warmth, laughter without depth, a gathering without gravity. That night, as they packed up to leave, she gave me a hug, firm and efficient. "Everything looked so perfect this year." "Grandma," she said, "thanks for letting me help." I nodded, smiled, watched as she swept out the door in her beige wool coat heels, clicking on the porch I'd painted myself the year before with aching knees and borrowed time. And when the door closed, I looked around at the soft golden lights, the scentless candles, the glass tree gleaming like it had never known a single pair of sticky toddler hands. I whispered perfect into the empty room. But what I meant was hollow. The silence after they left was the loudest thing I'd heard in years. It settled across the furniture like dust, gathering in the corners of the room, in the folds of my sweater, in the quiet space between my heartbeat and the ticking clock on the mantel. There was no music now, no laughter, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint echo of everything they hadn't said to me. I walked into the kitchen. The sink was full of dishes they said they'd get to later. The serving spoons were still sticky with cranberry, and someone had left a wine glass tipped on its side, a crimson smear seeping across the tablecloth I'd ironed just that morning. I didn't mind cleaning. I never had. But something about the way they'd left everything half done, half noticed, made me feel like the maid rather than the matriarch. They came, they took, they posed, and they left. And now, like always, I was the one holding the pieces. It wasn't just physical loneliness. It was something deeper, something sharp, a loneliness that crept beneath the skin into the marrow, the kind that only appears when you're surrounded by people who make you feel unseen. I poured myself a cup of tea, not to drink, but to hold. The warmth of it gave me something to cling to. I sat down at the end of the couch beside the untouched scarf I had knitted for my grandson. He hadn't even taken it with him. I reached out and touched it gently, brushing a loose thread back into place. I wondered if he'd notice it missing. I doubted it. I looked around the room, this room I had painted and repainted over the years, where every knick-knack had a story, where every cushion had once been chosen for comfort. But now nothing felt familiar. The new decorations, hers not mine, cast long shadows that didn't belong. The fireplace crackled in that artificial way. Hers always did, an electric insert humming instead of roaring. There was no scent of wood smoke, no trace of the old pine logs my husband used to haul in from the backyard, no lingering ember ash clinging to the hearth. This was still my house, but it didn't feel like my home anymore. The worst part of being forgotten isn't the silence, it's the performance. The way they smiled at me across the table, the way they said, "Love you, Grandma," without looking up from their phones, the way they told me I looked great, even though not one of them had noticed the brooch I wore, the one their grandfather gave me on our last Christmas together, before he passed. That brooch used to spark stories, used to be admired, touched. This year, no one asked, no one remembered. When you get older, people think they're being kind when they give you space, but space without connection becomes exile. I sat there that night and tried to remember the last time I felt truly seen by any of them, not politely acknowledged, not dutifully included, but seen. The way a child looks at their mother when they're scared, the way a friend sees you across the table and knows your heart before you speak. It had been years, too many. They say old age is lonely, and maybe that's true, but this wasn't about age. This was about presence. I was right there in front of them, and they'd looked right past me, over and over, until even I started to forget I was still here. I think what broke me that night was how automatic it had all become. They weren't being cruel. They weren't even being intentionally dismissive. They were just following the script they'd written without me. The granddaughter hosts now. The mother nods along. The cousins joke with each other. And I sit smiling, clapping at the right times, fading quietly into the background like an old photograph on the wall. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I'd known alone. I'd lived through the year my husband died, through nights when the house creaked with grief and the world outside seemed too quiet to bear. But even then, I wasn't lonely. Not like this. Because back then, even in sorrow, I still felt like I mattered. This was different. This was erasure. I stared at the empty chairs, the one my husband used to sit in, the one I always placed my son-in-law in because he liked the cushion, the small one I'd kept for the great-grandkids even though they were too old now, and mine by the window, the one I'd been reassigned to like a visitor, like a guest who didn't know where she belonged. I reached for the scarf again, wrapped it around my hands. The yarn was soft, warm. I'd chosen it carefully, the same shade of blue as my grandson's baby blanket. He wouldn't remember that. But I did. I remembered everything. And in that moment I decided something. I decided I wouldn't sit by the window anymore. I wouldn't shrink to fit a space someone else had assigned. I wouldn't keep decorating rooms for people who no longer asked what any of it meant. I wouldn't keep setting the table for those who walked in, took what they wanted, and left me in the quiet. Because this was still my house, my life, my story, and I would not be a footnote in it. They had left for the night, but something else had arrived, something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. As I lay in bed that night, the shadows of the Christmas lights still flickering faintly through the window, I realized something that should have struck me years ago. It wasn't the first time she'd done this. It wasn't the first time I'd been minimized, repositioned, gently pushed out of my own place. It had been happening in small, quiet ways, again and again, like the slow trickle of a faucet that eventually floods the floor. I thought back to Thanksgiving last year when I brought out my pecan pie warm and wobbling just the way it should be, and she laughed before saying, "Grandma, we actually brought a vegan one. But yours looks rustic." I'd smiled through that too. I'd eaten a slice of my own pie alone in the kitchen, while everyone else complimented the modern one her fiancé bought from a bakery downtown. Then there was my birthday, my 78th. They brought cake, they brought candles, they brought noise, but what they didn't bring was time. They stayed for 45 minutes. The candles were blown out, the cake was cut, a few pictures were taken, and they were already discussing dinner reservations they had made with friends that evening. I sat on the couch after they left a sliver of frosting still on the plate in my lap and whispered thank you to no one. They meant well. They always meant well. And that summer, when I'd gone to the hospital for chest pains, I remember her taking charge of the intake forms. "Grandma doesn't need to stress about the paperwork," she said, and I was grateful in the moment. But later, when I asked what medications they'd listed, she waved her hand and said, "It's all handled." That should have been the moment. That should have been when I said, "No, I'll speak for myself." But I didn't. I let her take the pen. How many pens had I handed over in silence? I began to understand that the Christmas incident wasn't an isolated thing. It was just the clearest, sharpest expression of something that had been growing for years. The shift from respect to patronization, from inclusion to oversight, from family to performance. It happened with the way she redecorated the guest bedroom when I offered to let her stay for a few weeks after her lease ended. She came in with boxes of framed prints, new curtains, bedding. "It's just temporary," she said. "But I can't sleep in a space that doesn't feel like me. Never mind that the quilt was one I'd sewn by hand. Never mind that the lamp by the bed had been in the family for 40 years. I came in one day to find it all boxed up helpfully, of course. She'd always been helpful, always taking the lead in group texts, planning outings, organizing birthdays. But over time, her help stopped feeling like support and started feeling like command. She decided what meals were ordered, what shows we watched, where we met, how long we stayed. I thought it was just her nature, efficient, modern, capable. But as I looked back on it, something became painfully clear. Her help came at the cost of my autonomy. And the others, they followed her lead. They didn't mean to, I don't think, but it was easier that way. Let her make the decisions, let her handle Grandma. It meant no one had to navigate the small frictions of aging, of memory, of tradition. It meant they could say, "She's just looking out for you," and move on with their lives. But I wasn't a burden. I wasn't a relic. I was a woman who had given everything, my body, my youth, my energy, my money, to build the very lives they now lived with such casual entitlement. I paid for their ballet lessons, their braces, their band trips, their emergencies. I held their hands through divorces and job losses and panic attacks, and slowly they thanked me with silence. Not malicious silence, just the kind that grows between people when someone stops being seen as necessary. That's the cruelest part of aging. You don't stop loving them, but you start wondering when they stopped loving you as you are, rather than loving the idea of you they're comfortable with. The quiet old lady, the warm background, the giver who never asks. But I was done asking, because if I traced this thread backward, I could see the pattern. The moments they forgot to invite me, the holidays where they showed up late, left early, said they'd make it up to me, the time I offered to host Easter and was told, "Oh, we already made brunch reservations," the way they told me after the fact when her fiancé proposed, as if I was a Facebook acquaintance. I remembered a moment years ago when I called her on a Tuesday just to talk. She sounded distracted. "I can't really chat right now, Grandma. I'm in the middle of something." She never called back. And when I mentioned it weeks later, she smiled and said, "Oh, I thought we covered everything," as if my voice was optional, disposable. Not the first time, no. That Christmas was just the one where I felt it so deeply I couldn't unfeel it, where the years of little slights and diminishing roles finally added up to something undeniable, where I finally realized I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was waiting for myself to come back. That night, lying in the dark with the scent of artificial pine still clinging to the air, I whispered out loud, "No more." It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, but it was final, because I would no longer allow myself to be handled like fine china precious, but unused. I was still here, and I would decide what happened next. Once you recognize that something is broken, you start to see all the cracks that led to the collapse. After that Christmas, something inside me refused to return to the usual softness. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't throw any grand confrontations into the air, like fireworks. No, I did something far more dangerous. I watched. I listened. I paid attention not as a grandmother eager to believe in the best, but as a woman finally tired of being fooled by polished manners and empty affection. I stopped explaining away their behavior. I stopped making excuses for why my calls went unanswered for days, why visits were postponed until after the quarter ends, why invitations were phrased more like obligations. And in the quiet weeks that followed Christmas, I began collecting evidence, not with malice, but with clarity. Clarity is a funny thing. It doesn't always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it creeps in like fog lifting at dawn, revealing what's been there all along. I watched how my granddaughter spoke to the people around her. She corrected waiters at restaurants with a fake laugh that made the correction sting worse. She made suggestions that were really commands. When I visited her apartment at her invitation a few weeks after Christmas, because she said she wanted to check in, I noticed how she dismissed her fiancé's opinions in front of others, wrapping her control in little jokes. Don't listen to him, he still thinks stovetop popcorn is fancy. They all laughed. I didn't. That night she took a call while I sat in her living room. Her voice dropped into that same syrupy cadence she used with me. Of course I'd love to help. Well, she's just not all there anymore, but I'll make sure she understands the paperwork. I stared at the wall while she spoke. I knew who she was talking about. I knew. And when she returned smiling and said, "Sorry, just work stuff," I smiled back. But inside something went quiet, still, settled. I watched how she spoke about my house, the one I'd built from savings and sacrifice, the one my husband and I painted together one summer with cheap brushes and better dreams. She told a friend over lunch that it was quaint, and then added, "It'll make a great reno someday. Not if, when." That same week, my daughter dropped by briefly, just long enough to pick up a casserole dish she'd left behind. She stood in the doorway like she was too busy to come in. "Everything okay, Mom?" she asked, checking her phone between glances. "Everything's just fine," I said, and she didn't notice the steel beneath my words. She nodded and kissed my cheek already halfway down the steps before I'd shut the door. They weren't listening anymore. Not to my words, not to my silence. I watched the bank statements too, the little notes in my account, the way my granddaughter had once offered to help manage my utilities online, how I'd given her the login when I thought it would ease her burden. I checked the activity. A few things had changed. Nothing major, but small things. Transfers, subscription renewals I didn't recognize, a second mobile line I'd never used. Nothing illegal, but intentional, entitled. She had assumed it was hers already, my money, my name, my future. And that's when I remembered the will. It had been years since I looked at it. I'd written it after my husband passed in the thick of grief, when I still saw all of them through the rose-colored lens of family. Everything was divided evenly. I hadn't given it another thought until now. Now I saw clearly. They hadn't changed overnight. I had, or rather I had finally stopped pretending not to see it. All those years of soft gratitude, of nodding along, while they told me how amazing my cooking was, all, while discarding the leftovers before they left the driveway. All those times they thanked me for babysitting, then disappeared for the weekend with no check-in call. All those Mother's Days where the gifts got more expensive but the visits got shorter. I had mistaken their politeness for love. But love, I knew, doesn't dismiss you in the middle of your own story. It doesn't silence your memories with convenience. It doesn't assign you a role and expect you never to rewrite it. I had given them everything I had, and they assumed they deserved it. But that assumption was theirs, and the power to challenge it was mine. That week I made a pot of coffee. I set out my notebook in the folder marked Legacy. I read the will every word. I highlighted the sections that had once brought me comfort. And then I stared out the window, fingers pressed to my lips, remembering all the moments, big and small, that brought me here. Watching gave me something I hadn't had in years. Control. Not loud control. Not the kind you wield with shouting or slamming doors. No. This was the quiet kind. The kind that moves like a shadow. The kind they never see coming because they've forgotten. You can still move, still act, still matter. I wasn't powerless. I was patient, and my patience had run out. It had been tucked away in the bottom drawer of my writing desk beneath old postcards, a few faded photographs, and a bundle of dried lavender tied with a ribbon from my husband's funeral. I kept that folder there not because I forgot about it, but because I trusted I wouldn't need to change what was inside. Trust. I've come to realize is often what keeps women like me quiet too long. The folder was blue, the label peeling a little at the edges, my handwriting scrawled across the tab, Estate and Legacy, Private. My fingers hesitated for just a second before opening it, not from fear, but from mourning. Mourning the woman I had been when I first wrote what was inside. That version of me still believed in fairness, still believed that love was enough, still believed that being a good mother, a good grandmother, would mean being remembered with kindness when the time came. I unfolded the will, my glasses slipped to the tip of my nose, my hand steady as I flattened the pages against the kitchen table, the one where so many birthdays had been celebrated, so many lessons taught, so many unspoken tears wiped away with napkins and warm soup. I read every line slowly. Equal distribution, fair shares, my daughter, my son gone now, his portion passed to my granddaughter. I remembered making that change after the funeral, my heart shattered but certain. I wanted her to feel secure, to know she was still cherished, even though her father had been taken too soon. And she had been cherished, too much perhaps, loved so thoroughly, so blindly that I hadn't noticed when love turned into license, into expectation, into quiet entitlement. The house was to be sold, the assets divided, my jewelry and heirlooms dispersed among the family, with notes I had written by hand, for the one who remembers Christmas mornings best, to the child who still believes in making bread from scratch. I had believed back then that these words would be met with tears and reverence. Now I wondered if they'd even be read at all, or if the attorney's voice would simply drone over them as they scanned the numbers and moved on. The part that struck me most was the last paragraph. It was something I'd written in a moment of warmth, when the world still felt full of promise. I leave these gifts not just for what you've done, but for who you've been to me. May these tokens carry forward the love that built them. I reread that line 3 times, each time it cut deeper. Because who had they been to me lately? Caretakers, no, not truly. My health was decent, my mind intact, my bills paid, but they had treated me like someone who needed to be managed, softened, wrapped in bubble wrap, and patted on the head. Not someone with agency, not someone with memory. Had they loved me? I believe they once did. But now I felt like a legacy in waiting, a name on a title, a placeholder for a future transaction, something they'd already begun dividing in their minds. I thought of the house, my house, the wood floors I'd scrubbed on hands and knees, the wallpaper I'd chosen with my daughter in the spring of '87, the garden where my husband's ashes now rested beneath the stone angel. They'd said it was cute, but old-fashioned. They joked about how many upgrades it would need. My granddaughter had even asked once, months ago, "Do you have any idea what this place is worth now?" She laughed when she said it, but I heard what was underneath. Yes, I knew what it was worth. To me it was sacred. To them it was equity. I picked up a pen. My hand hovered over the will. I thought not of revenge, but of restoration, of setting things right, not for them, but for myself. I had the right to decide what my life's work would support, who would inherit my care, who had earned not just my money, but my memory. There was no rage in me as I began making notes. No bitterness, only precision, clarity, a quiet sense of reclaiming something I had almost lost, myself. I wrote a name that had never appeared in the previous version, the woman who delivered groceries during the pandemic and always stopped to chat. She had once shoveled my walkway without being asked. I wrote the name of the church down the road, the one that still delivered hot meals to shut-ins, and never forgot my birthday. I thought of the local women's shelter that had helped my friend June get back on her feet after she lost everything. Yes, they would do something meaningful with a donation. I thought of my neighbor's grandson who'd mowed my lawn all summer and refused payment just because grandma's got to stay cool. These were the people who had seen me, not just watched me age. The will would need to be rewritten officially, of course. I wasn't naive. But this first draft, was my act of awakening. My reminder that I was not a relic. I was not done. I still had choices, power, purpose. I sat for a long time after that. The house was quiet, but no longer heavy. I had opened the window again, yes, even if the eucalyptus diffuser said not to. Outside, the wind moved through the branches, rustling the trees, like pages of a story being rewritten. I folded the old will and slipped it back into the folder, not as an ending, but as evidence of how far I'd come. Because love, real love, doesn't silence. It doesn't decorate over memory. It doesn't call control help. And it certainly doesn't measure worth by inheritance. I pressed my palm flat over the folder and whispered more to myself than to anyone else I remember who I am. And this time I wasn't going to forget. It was a Tuesday, bright, but cold, the kind of day where light feels sharp against your skin, and everything outside is quiet in a way that makes your thoughts louder. I woke early, as I always do, the rhythm of age and habit, keeping time better than any alarm clock ever could. But this morning I didn't start with tea or bread or quiet reflections by the window. I walked to the kitchen, opened the drawer where I kept old business cards, and found the one I'd tucked behind a rubber-banded bundle of grocery coupons and appliance warranties. It had been years since I'd needed it off-white, a little creased around the corners, but the ink still clear. Marcia Singh, Elder Law and Estate Planning. I stared at the number for a long while, the dial tone already ringing in my ear, before I realized my finger had pressed the buttons. When she picked up, I heard the familiar tone measured warm with the crispness of someone who remembers details. "Marcia, it's me," I said. "I need to come in." She didn't ask why, just said tomorrow at 10. "Yes," I said, "that's perfect." I ended the call and exhaled, not a sigh of dread, but something else, something cleaner, like I'd finally opened a window in a house that had grown musty with silence. That night I gathered everything, not just the will and the folder of accounts and documents, but the smaller things, the little handwritten letters I'd planned to include with specific keepsakes, the envelope marked for my granddaughter, with the recipe for my cinnamon rolls, and a pressed flower from her christening. I held it in my hands, fingers trembling not from age but from grief, because that envelope, that legacy, no longer felt deserved. I kept it anyway for now, but I placed it aside, and beside it, I started a new one. This time addressed to someone who'd once brought me soup when I was sick, a gesture made, without cameras, captions, or strings. She may not be family by blood, but she had treated me with something rarer than tradition. She had treated me with presence. The next morning I dressed with more care than usual, not for them, but for me. A soft gray coat I'd worn to my grandson's wedding, a blue scarf knitted by my own mother decades ago. I pinned on the brooch my husband gave me on our 20th anniversary, a simple gold circle with a pearl in the center. When he gave it to me, he said, "So you never forget who you are." I had forgotten, but not anymore. The drive to the law office was quiet. I didn't play the radio. I didn't rush. The world moved outside my window like a slideshow, people in coats, mothers with strollers, bundled children at crosswalks. And I thought, they have no idea that today is the day I take my life back. When I arrived, Marcia greeted me with a kind smile and ushered me into her office, the scent of coffee and worn leather settling around us. I handed her the folder. She flipped through it carefully, her fingers gliding across the pages like someone reading a sacred text. I want to make changes, I said, not out of anger, just truth. She nodded. Of course. And I began. We rewrote sections, cleaned up the language, removed names, added new ones. I asked her to include letters with certain bequests, words I wanted remembered, not just instructions followed. When we got to the house, I paused. I wanted to go to someone who would live in it, I said, not someone who'll rip out the walls and call it a flip. She looked up. You don't have to give it to family. I nodded. I know. I left the beneficiary section blank for a moment. I needed more time, more watching, more truth. But the seed was planted, the structure in place. The power was mine again, not as revenge, but as recognition. When we were done, she said, You sure about this? I've never been surer. I signed my name, my full name, slowly, carefully. I watched the ink soak into the paper. That signature wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. A signature that said, I see myself again. I am not invisible. Driving home, the clouds rolled in thick, heavy snow-bellied. The first flakes drifted like whispers across the windshield. I remembered winters past the ones, when my granddaughter was small, running through the yard with red cheeks and wool mittens squealing when snow hit her tongue. I remembered her calling me Mimi and hiding candy canes behind my back. I remembered believing she would carry the warmth of those days into adulthood. And maybe she did, for a time. But somewhere along the way, performance replaced memory and control replaced care. That afternoon, I made a cup of tea and sat by the window in my seat, not the one she assigned me, but the one I chose. The scarf she had bought me for Christmas hung neatly in the closet untouched. I wore the one I made for myself, thick and uneven but warm. And I truly felt, for the first time in years, that this house still belonged to me, not just in deed but in spirit. Not just because the paperwork said so, but because I had reclaimed the meaning of it. It wasn't a house filled with curated images. It was a home filled with memory. And now my legacy would reflect that. No more blurred lines, no more polite erasure, no more empty performances disguised as love. Because the next time they smiled at me, they would smile not at the woman they assumed I was, but at the woman I had always been. They never asked, not once, not in the weeks after Christmas, not after the new year arrived and passed without a single call, not after the thank you notes failed to appear even as the photo albums filled up online with images from their New Year's Eve party sparkle champagne captions about fresh starts and surrounding yourself with your people. I wasn't in any of them, not even in memory. And yet I waited. Part of me still hoped she'd come. That one afternoon I'd hear a knock open the door and find her there, face softer eyes, lowered, hands, empty of any camera or curated tray of pastries, that she'd sit on my couch and say, I think I went too far. I think I forgot who you are. I would have forgiven her. I really would have. But that conversation never came. What came instead were texts, sparse clipped timed like duty. Hey Grandma, hope you're well. Just checking in, been crazy busy. Let us know if you need anything. They came without follow-up, without warmth, without space for a reply. that would actually be read. Words for show, placeholders to ease their conscience. And so I responded in kind. Doing fine, thank you. I sent them from my kitchen table, the one that once held 3 generations around it, and now held only me and my tea. The same table where just a few weeks earlier I had rewritten everything, every name, every choice, every legacy. I think what hurt the most wasn't that they didn't ask what had changed. It's that they didn't even notice. They'd moved on, still assuming, still orbiting the idea of me, never the real me. My granddaughter posted photos from brunch with captions like "grateful for strong women in my life," while I sat home with no seat at the table. I smiled bitterly. Apparently strength was now defined by aesthetic, not sacrifice. And I began to understand something deeper. People only ask questions when they want real answers. My silence wasn't just unnoticed. It was convenient. They had gotten used to the version of me that nodded and smiled and handed over everything without asking for anything in return. Why would they suspect I'd changed course? One afternoon, I stood at the window watching the mail truck pull away. There was a card in the mailbox, my granddaughter's handwriting on the envelope. I held it for a long moment before opening. Inside a simple store-bought card, soft watercolor flowers and the words, "Thinking of you." Inside just her signature. No message. I placed it on the mantel. It looked pretty next to the new photo I had framed, a picture not of her, not of any family member, but of me. Young beaming apron on standing beside a table full of food and faces and feeling. A photo from decades ago, back when no one had to pose, back when I was still the heart, not the background. That night I lit the old cinnamon candle, the one she had said was too strong. I let it fill the room. I baked a small batch of sugar cookies just for myself. I played Nat King Cole on the record player, and as the music warmed the corners of the house, I let myself laugh out loud, just once, sharp and sudden, not at a joke, but at the sheer relief of being back in my own skin. They didn't know what I'd done. They didn't know the will had changed the house, reassigned the letters, rewritten. They still posted about family legacy, and assumed that legacy meant them. It didn't. Not anymore. The conversation I had imagined her eyes wide, her voice trembling, "Why, Grandma? Why would you change it?" never happened. But I rehearsed my answer anyway, quietly, just in case. Because I was tired of being forgotten while alive, only to be celebrated when gone. Because you stopped seeing me as a woman and started treating me like a fixture. Because love isn't decoration, it's attention. And I had given you both for years while you gave me appearances. And maybe someday she'll discover what I did. Maybe she'll walk into a lawyer's office after I'm gone expecting a ceremony and finding instead a mirror. Maybe she'll sit there stunned, wondering when it all changed. She'll look for the moment she lost the house, the keepsakes, the letters. She'll ask, "Was it something I did?" And the answer will be, "It was everything you didn't." But by then it won't matter. The shift will have already occurred. Because this wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. And truth doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in withheld forgiveness, in a blank space where your name used to be. The conversation never happened. And maybe that's the most painful justice of all. The next Christmas came colder than the last, the kind of winter that settles early and stays long. I had begun preparing in November, not out of habit, but out of intention. There would be no invitations, no group texts, no reminders. The table would be smaller, the house quieter, but every decision was mine. Every dish, every candle, every sound. For the first time in decades, I set the table for one. There was peace in that, not sadness, not quite. Maybe a soft ache, yes, but also relief. Relief from the orchestration, the performance, the bright lights that had drowned out the warmth. I used my old tablecloth, the one with a red wine stain from the Christmas of '96, when my son-in-law tripped over a toy truck and nearly took the ham with him. I smiled at the memory. It wasn't a perfect dinner, but it was real. That morning I baked gingerbread cookies in silence, no playlist dictating the mood, no one shifting the trays or correcting the spice. I put on my favorite apron, the one with the faded holly leaves stitched across the front, and I hummed. A real hum. From the chest, not for show. The tree was smaller this year, a potted spruce I bought from the local nursery. I decorated it with the old handmade ornaments they'd once hidden at the back. The tin soldier, the crocheted snowflakes, the little paper angel my daughter made in the 2nd grade. I placed each one with care. No symmetry, no theme, just memory, just love. I lit real candles, the dripping kind, the kind that melt into soft pools, leave rings on the table, and perfume the room with wax and fire. I let them burn down, unworried about the mess. There were no matching gift bags, no gold-accented centerpiece, just a bundle of fresh pine in an old vase tied with red ribbon. There was no chair for them at the table. Not out of spite, out of necessity. I couldn't share a meal with people who saw my life as a relic, my traditions as obstacles, my house as future property. I couldn't set a place for those who had stopped looking me in the eye years ago. They hadn't called, not once in the weeks leading up to Christmas. No check-ins, no, what can we bring? Just a single text from my granddaughter on December 23rd. You doing anything this year? If not, we might swing by. If not, that told me everything I needed to know. I didn't reply. Instead, I spent the evening before Christmas preparing a small roast dicing carrots, the way my husband liked peeling potatoes, slowly letting each task hold meaning instead of urgency. I pulled out the old photo albums again, sat with them, let myself cry gently at the sight of all those little faces now grown into strangers. And then I lit the fire, a real one. With wood I had stacked myself. It crackled the way fires are meant to, not humming behind glass, but breathing into the room, warming the bones, whispering comfort. I ate my dinner by the firelight, 1 plate, 1 glass of wine, 1 thick slice of chocolate cake with raspberry preserves. I toasted aloud to no one, to peace, and to the woman who found it. I did not feel lonely, because I was no longer shrinking myself to fit their silence. I was no longer contorting tradition to match their design. I wasn't worried about being cropped out of photos, or corrected mid-sentence, or dressed up like a doll for their curated content. I was home, and I was present. When I walked past the empty living room chair, the one she used to sit in with her list, her plans, her instructions, I didn't feel regret. I felt space, open, quiet space, the kind where grief can breathe, the kind where healing begins. I thought of all the years I had hosted with aching feet and a grateful heart, and then all the years I hosted with aching heart and a forced smile. I thought of the candles blown out the table, reassigned the legacy assumed. This time I reclaimed it. There was no chair for them this year, not because they weren't welcome, but because they no longer came with presents. They came with demands, with edits, with a script that didn't have room for me, and I wasn't going to audition anymore. I wrote no Christmas cards that year. I answered no calls. Instead, I wrote a letter to myself. It read, "You were always the heart of this home. You gave, you carried, you anchored. And when the world forgot, you remembered. This Christmas is yours again. All of it. The flicker of candlelight, the whisper of old songs, the steam of cider in your favorite mug. You are not alone. You are becoming. And I tucked that letter in the same drawer where the old will used to be. A new document, a new truth, replacing the version of me they thought would stay quiet forever. Let them wonder someday where it all changed. Let them sit with the silence. It says more than I ever could. It wasn't a grand reveal. There was no dramatic confrontation, no teary-eyed apology, no last-minute redemption arc. Life doesn't often give us those scenes. Sometimes the most powerful endings happen in absolute silence, long after anyone's still paying attention. The letter arrived in their hands 3 months after Christmas. Certified mail, plain envelope, the kind that looks bureaucratic until you feel the weight of it. I know how it unfolded. I can imagine it clearly. My granddaughter opening it in her spotless kitchen. Her hands manicured, her mouth already twisted into a half smile, assuming it was something routine. Perhaps even believing it was a note of gratitude or a checklist of assets, something tidy she could skim before brunch. But it wasn't. Inside was the final version of my will, signed, notarized, irrevocable. The estate had been reassigned. The house, my house, was now bequeathed to the local historical society, with a stipulation that it be preserved exactly as it stood. The furniture, the photographs, the handwritten recipes in the drawers, a tribute to a woman who had built a life out of modest means and immense love. It would become a memory they could visit, but never own. The money divided carefully. A portion to the shelter down the street that helps women escape situations they're told they must endure. Another to the community garden, where strangers brought me soup and laughter. And a final portion to a scholarship fund for young girls who want to study history, so they know the worth of the stories women leave behind when no one listens. There was nothing for them. No jewelry, no cash, no family heirlooms, as my granddaughter once called the china she already measured for her cabinet. I left a note instead, handwritten, folded into the same envelope. It was short, gentle, but final. Legacy is not about blood. It is about memory, and memory, like love, must be earned. I didn't expect gratitude. I didn't need it. What I needed, what I had finally given myself, was freedom from the weight of their expectations, from the pain of being diminished in the name of politeness, from the long years of smiling through corrections being hosted in my own home, edited out of my own life. They left me with silence, so I gave them the same, but mine had more truth in it. There's a power in leaving nothing, not out of cruelty, but clarity, because the nothing I left them wasn't an absence. It was a mirror, a reflection of the attention they withheld, the affection they rationed, the eyes they averted when my voice softened with age. In the weeks after the will was read, I didn't hear from them, not a word, and strangely I didn't expect to. I think they assumed I was senile, that someone had influenced me, that I didn't know what I was doing. But I did. I had never seen so clearly. I'd lived long enough to know that people show you who they are not in crisis, but in routine, in how they treat you when no one's watching, in how they leave you sitting by the window still waiting for the warmth that never arrives. And I had grown tired of waiting. The afternoon after the letters were sent, I went for a walk through my neighborhood. The wind was sharp, but familiar, like the kind that used to wrap around me on the way to school as a child. I walked slowly, my cane tapping against the pavement, my breath puffing in soft clouds. I passed the garden and waved to the children tending the early green sprouts. I paused at the bakery where the owner always set aside one scone just for me. I belonged here, not as someone to be managed or humored, but as someone remembered, seen. When I returned home, I opened the windows wide, let the scent of spring in. It smelled like lemon and earth. I made a small lunch, played music, lit a candle cinnamon this time, let it drip all the way down. And I smiled, because they had always assumed I would leave them something. They just never thought I'd leave them nothing with so much meaning.